I'm Marnie Webb. I'm with TechSoup, and welcome to day 2 of TechSoup Talks. Like so many of us, my colleagues at TechSoup and I have been focusing on what's necessary for civil society organizations to be confident, secure, and resilient as they face the challenges in their communities and as they deliver on their missions. We know how much pressure organizations are under, that their digital threats are growing, the pace of change is quickening. And there's a real need. We think there's a real need for these kinds of spaces where people can think together across sectors, roles, and geographies. And that's why we started doing these TechSoup Talks focused on 5 main topic areas: security, data, misinformation, counter-narratives, and collaboration. Yesterday, our focus was on digital security. We had 2 speakers. Today, we're going to have turned our attention to the idea of data governance. We began the day with Fabio Fraticelli of Social Techno, the organization with whom we partner for TechSoup Italy. And now we welcome Héc Maldonado-Reis. Héc is the managing director of TechImpact's Impact Strategy team. And in that role, they assist and advise clients on strategic technology assessments, planning, and work with those organizations on measurement and evaluation services. Héc has a wide variety of skills. They're an engineer, a data scientist, a public health and nonprofit professional, and Héc has been a key part of TechImpact's data efforts broadly and is here to share some thoughts with us about data governance. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Héc.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone, and excited to be here today. Partially, feel free to drop questions and comments down the line. If we don't get to them today, more than happy to connect otherwise. But excited for this discussion today, to be here with all of you. And partially, we've organized this discussion and conversation around data governance, thinking about coordination requiring clarity. Oftentimes, we find that people are using different perspectives, terms, knowledge, and so it's really important to anchor what we know before trying to operate on it. And so that's what I'll be discussing with you all today. Oh, my cursor disappeared. There we go. All right, then the agenda for today, just briefly, we'll talk a little brief about what is data governance. And then more importantly, I think I want to get right into why should we care about this, a little bit of regulations, because we can't really think about data governance without regulatory affairs and what that means as an organization. And then thinking about ecosystems of data governance and how we can possibly expand the current models of ecosystems to really include justice and power dynamics consideration. So let me start off by just giving us a simple definition. You can find variable definitions for what data governance is. It's a complicated term to some degree. But at the end of the day, you can think of data governance individually for an organization as a framework. And it's essentially a framework that it is inclusive of policies, operational and programmatic decisions, right? We're mission-driven organizations and social good organizations. So we're programmatic organizations, many of us. And it's really to ensure its validity, secure and replicable and responsible, right? If we have a process in place and we want to provide some sort of rigor to how we're managing and governing, there has to be replicability. And that's really important that it's done responsibly. So that's just a framing. You can find, again, different definitions that are expansive, but at least for the purposes of this discussion, you can think through this lens as we go along. Now, more simplistically and cheeky a little bit, I just kind of like put a little bit of space to say that data governance is not data management, right? Like we want to separate that. They're embedded, right? They're nested. So data management is nested within the principles of data governance. But traditionally, when we think about management, it's really about moving things around. And that's, to put it in simple terms, right? Or orchestrating them for that matter. But really, when we're taking a step above for data governance, we're really thinking about the intersection between strategy and implementation. And then on the other side of that is really evaluating what it was that we implemented. And so in that scale of process is where there's a bit of distinction. Data management itself could be more of the technical aspects of data management, but when we're thinking about governance is really when we start thinking about things like the people, our associates, the individuals of lives that we're reaching, and then also things like culture and values, right? So when we're thinking about as a mission-driven organizations, important. And so just starting out that there's a definition for data governance, but almost as we're thinking about this process, I just want us to keep in mind that management is really important, but the governance aspect is almost a stewardship around this process. And so how does data governance help, right? Why should we do this? And I think that that's really important. So number one is that data governance is almost a roadmap, right? So we steward individuals to responsibly handle data, but importantly, analytics and inferences too, right? So when we're talking about data governance, we're collecting data to analyze it likely or make decisions or inferences from it. So it's not just a framework that has to span about how data is managed, it's also how the analytics are conducted and how the inferences are evaluated. That also includes the component of communication, right? How do we communicate what we found from the data and who gets to have the power to be able to interpret that information? From a second lens, it's accuracy, quality, and applicability. Those are more self-explanatory, but I'm sure many of us have had the experiences of working sometimes in the past in Excel sheets and then going into some field and finding that the data was missing, that it was misrecorded, that there are different types. And so you fall into challenges about not just the quality of the data, but then its usability. And I think that really importantly, a last concept here, which wraps up really nicely with security and all the conversations that TechSoup is leading this week, is really thinking about risk management and risk mitigation. It's no secret that in emerging technology world, this is even more of a principle that we need to keep in mind, right? We don't know what we don't know. One of the greatest things about innovation is that it brings new, but it also is uncharted territory, so it is ungoverned. So when we are innovating as as collectives and as a sector, it's almost as if when we're going into this innovative space, we really need to start charting how is the best way that we should be going about this and finding ways to determine if we're doing that accordingly. So that's why we should care about data governance. Now, I think that really importantly, I wanted to provide a bit of a lens to how, again, regulatory affairs is one thing, and I do recognize that this is a global group, so I have some perception here, both a little bit more US based, but I'll explain the reasoning. I invite you all to kind of look about and connect on what are the implications to your own jurisdictions, because some of these might apply to you or some version of it might be impactful. But I wanted to give you an introduction to some of the acts and that at both federal and state level that have been implemented that at country actually that are providing us with some sort of frameworks around data governance. Not that they're explicit all data governance frameworks, but they almost build upon what we talked about earlier. So from the concept of data management to data governance, and that's why you see a little bit of progression here. So HIPAA, for those of you who don't know, is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It was enacted in 1996 in the United States. Now, reason I bring this up, there's other versions of it. There's FERPA, which is for education, but for this cases, it was really one of the first times where there was a formalization about how should private and sensitive data be managed because it was health data. And so in that sense, it was really thinking about sensitivity and security, right? And the concept of PII and all those terms that we all use, it really comes from that dynamic of we should be protecting people. Simply because we know that because there's a definition for how data is going to be used, doesn't exclude the fact that that same data can be used for a different purpose. And so this was one of that almost framing around purpose in that sense. So for the United States, this was late 90s. And as you might imagine, with the boom of the internet, it became even more important in terms of dissemination of information and putting restrictions to where that information can go. Sarbanes-Oxley is 2002, so just 6 years later or so, you can imagine I brought this up because initially HIPAA is about patient sensitivity and health information, so it's very patient-centric or individual-centric. But then moving forward, Sarbanes-Oxley really thought about financial management, right? So it's about financial data. So now you're starting to see that it's not just those that are working directly with individuals on a clinical lens or on a more like social lens. It's also just the boom of the fintech industry and all the information that was being integrated. And can we integrate data from 3 different locations to create a model or something of the nature? So it's almost about the same sensitivities for health information, but then also thinking about a different sector that now involves also the private sector, right? Because a lot of organizations, banks, you name it, right? They're kind of having to adapt and model how they're also responsibly using data. So it's not just the individual sensitivity alone, right, in the health space. Now we're also talking about in a commercial space and how the world around us exists and not in a vacuum. And so how do we connect both the social good part with the public good part, right? Those are 2 separate things, social and public good. And so that's a good distinction that really came about. And so I also included here GDPR for those of you who are not familiar, the General Data Protection Regulation. This is European. It's a European designation that initiated. It is also a great example of data sovereignty, simply because it's an entire country and a region that has decided a framework about great data governance that it applies to all the citizens of a location. And the important part about GDPR is that if you're processing European citizen or individual data outside of Europe, it also applies to you. So it's one of those first instances that this is a countrywide, right? In a large region. It's not state, it's not federal, but it is much larger, but it also has an almost bidirectionality. It's not just place-based, it's also about the information and where it's stored. So you might imagine that the world of like data farms or data centers and all these pieces, it's almost, how do you think about risk mitigation from that standpoint? Simply because of the regulatory governance practice too. So later on here, most recently, CCPA is the California Consumer Protection Act. And this is a state specific. So HIPAA and Sarbanes-Oxley were federal, talked about a countrywide regulatory framework that had implications. But then CCPA was in California, which actually gives the consumer its own validity over its own data. It's essentially, if I don't want you to use my data for something, I should have the right to be able to exit from that process somehow. So in terms of state data and maybe private data from like something you purchased and your information and it got stored, this is almost that endpoint to governance that starts presenting how individual choice is important, and data governance is not just an organizational matter, it's also about those implied by that governance as well. So in this aspect, we can think about sensitivity, specificity with finance data, right? And that's a more exhaustive ecosystem. But then also just the directionality of jurisdiction. And then I, as an individual, should have choice. And that almost is the progression that we've seen. Things take time, right? Changes take time. And especially when we're thinking about regulatory affairs, design to implementation is also a big component. We can see something that gets enacted, but it takes a long period to see it through, simply because data systems, infrastructure is needed, change management is important. But a large component of this has been leadership needs as well. As new spaces come and develop and as new innovations come about, like I mentioned earlier, we really need to seek out those that can kind of lead some of the governance structures that are necessary, but the considerations that we might be missing in some degree. Look at progression of regulations to anchor essentially how we've seen this in practice and like, why does it matter, right? These are more tangible examples. Let me take a step back and maybe introduce to some. Most of you might be familiar with this, but I've created, I like buckets. And so I've bucketed here what I consider a typical data, and most consider a typical data governance ecosystem. And I'll walk through a little bit, and not to exhaustion, but I want to explain what they all mean and how they matter to an organization, and as you're making decisions, where your brain should be focusing on. First is operations and processes, right? If you don't have the systems in place to govern your data or integrate your data or protect your data, number one, right, is you need to have the operational, administrative ability, and then also the processes about that. And when I mean processes is, how do we do this? Internal documents, whether they're policies, that's one thing. But the processes are important. On the second side is policies and regulations. And this is internal and external. So organizations have organizational policies, and then there is external policies that they're implied by, and then there's regulatory affairs that might be more expansive. Whether that's like a small region, I was going to use county as an example, but there's different regionalities here. Whether it's like a small region or a large region, there's regulatory processes that are sometimes in tension with each other. And so the organizations themselves are left having to navigate how do their policies reflect and actually represent and engage well with the regulatory decisions that they have been. Privacy and security, if y'all joined yesterday, I think you heard from the best about security and privacy. But I think really importantly, it's just, we can't ignore this as a central principle. Simply, if you go back to the HIPAA example, right, of sensitivity, that's where we started. We started with privacy. We started with protecting individuals. And now we're at a place where we're wanting to give individuals choice about how at risk their data is. So without understanding the concerns for privacy and security, there's no risk mitigation around them. So when you're planning for your tech stack, or you're planning on what technology investments you need to make and what processes have to be implemented from that standpoint, it's most important when we go back to the principles of private and identifiable information from there. Data management comes back. And so I told you all that it's almost embedded, right? It's not like it's written matter. But when I'm thinking about data management, it's really explicitly the entire life cycle of data management. And here I'm saying from creation to destruction. So let me say a little bit more what that means. So particularly when we collect data, even before we collect the data, we design ways to collect the data, right? So from that process of whether it's a database or a cloud space, the surveys you make, and then the data you collect, that process all is data management, all the way down to destruction. I think that most of us might be familiar that there are lifespans to how much for certain funding or certain programs that you might be engaged. There is almost an expected timeline that you should have your data, right? You should be able to reference your data, even if it's the past. But for how long is the question, right? And for how long because the longer you retain data, the longer you have to protect it, the longer you have to govern it. And so there are places where there is almost an exit out of governance, but it has to be purposeful when the data is no longer needed. So that's important. It's a dynamic that is a little bit tenuous because everybody would love to go back 100 years and have all the data from early 1900 so that we can plot everything longitudinally. But when we think about this, just the availability and almost like openness and accessibility of that data is important to consider when it's being destroyed. So just keep a big projection that that should be inclusive of data management. Infrastructure, I mentioned this briefly, but again, if your systems or in your technology infrastructure are just not in place, it's just impossible. One of the other challenges is that I say infrastructure very loosely because sometimes for organizations, infrastructure could be a cabinet file. And for a long time, that practice has been okay to some degree, but it's such an interconnected world. Well, it's such an interconnected world. And then the real realities of what we just talked about from regulatory processes and complying with those policies and regulatory processes, we're just not there anymore. And so how do we create the minimal effort of technology needed to be able to sustain a responsible governance practice is an important question. Even for those who think that nobody's going to collect this data, or I'm going to carry this file with me. I'm going to go into a meeting and carry this file with me. We don't think about that necessarily, but we also could think about losing that file and what is that risk for that individual if you lost it in person. And then lastly is compliance and ethics. And it's not because it's least important. I feel like these are the most challenging in many ways because it's a bookending experience for me, compliance and ethics. So we should always start. My philosophy is a little bit different from human-centered is human first. And I think that in general concept is how can we think about a lot of the implications? And that's what ethics is, right? And responsibility and values-driven design. So how can we really think about the first ed before designing any process? How do we think about the inclusion of who's defining our governance practice and all those components come into play? But then compliance, other than regulatory compliance with like government or your funder, perhaps, or partners for that matter, it's also compliance internal to the organization, right? Because compliance is associated to surveillance and monitoring. So how do you know people are not responsibly governing data if there is no compliance framework that you have? It has a challenge because for organizations that are already sometimes capacity limited, what are we going to do? Are we going to start losing everybody because they're not complying with data practices? But once there's a compliance process and policies in place, there has to be almost like an acknowledgement of them, and decisions need to be made around that. So that's why it's the most challenging in many ways, simply because it has implications for your workforce. It has implications for human resources, payroll, and all those pieces on top of all the implications for data and security and validity and all that. So this is what I consider a typical data governance ecosystem. And I'm just going to introduce two different buckets that are meaningful here. They're almost perhaps have come up in some of my wording here and there, but it's just to be explicit about them. It's the same 6 buckets, but we also need to introduce power dynamics and data justice. And I'll introduce you to what I'm defining by those pieces and why they matter. But this is a little bit more, I don't know if nuance is the right word, but it is more modern than it was when we started back with making sure that we could get things on the road. Meaning like, let's just make sure we have something in place, or let's just make sure that we have something to govern. That doesn't necessarily work anymore because we're at a place where individuals have choice. And so when there is an individual that has choice and we're already knowledgeable about how their data could be sensitive, now you have to engage with that individual. So there's a two-way street. It's no longer, this is what we're doing. It's how are we doing it together? So what do I mean by power dynamics and data justice? This can mean a lot of things, and we can have a whole day session on this conversation about what these two things are. But I wanted to give you a few bullet points about why they matter and how they have implications. So let me start with power dynamics. Power dynamics really comes into play with historical, current, and future power. And power, it's really about who gets to make the decisions and who gets to have the final say. When you think about that, really some of the challenges are that for many, many reasons, we end up not introducing participatory engagement with the communities we serve. So what do I mean by that? We might define a framework and just tell them this is what we're doing, or not even tell them or communicate it, but they're subject to a process in some way, or at least their data is. And so how do you engage the communities to understand if what we're doing is how they would like it to be done? And how do you find the balance in that space? Representation is really important. This is not just from a leadership standpoint or that philosophy. It's just because proximity is important, right? So when we're sometimes managing data, we might miss things that we don't know just because we don't belong to the data that the community is representing. And so representation is important so that there is almost like an internal embedment into that governance framework. And so how do you make that happen? Big component there is that you need to train the people today that you need tomorrow, but tomorrow keeps changing and the needs for tomorrow keep changing from a governance standpoint. So that's the challenge there. Data use purposes, it's like I said, like if you collect my data to tell me whether or not I have, it's a clinical example, high blood pressure, right? And send me a message through my mobile device or something. I don't want you to send me ads about medication for that if I didn't necessarily know that that was happening. So it's the data purpose and it's like the multi-purpose and the redirection of data that can be challenging, especially when there's now other fields getting integrated. And then lastly, it's just inclusion. And by inclusion, I just really mean people should be embedded and like I mentioned before, human first rather than human centric and trying to orchestrate it towards them. It's like, how do you include the communities and the data and the people and the stakeholders, right? Expansive stakeholders into the entire process of that data governance. So that's power dynamic in a very like reductionist example, but these are the reasons why it matters. And a lot of the challenges are cultural and just different culture values, knowledge. And so it's many different pieces of a myriad of changes. And then data justice, perhaps a little more nuanced again, but it's also deeply, deeply historical. We've seen data justice come about in different ways. It's just that now there's a huge component that technology both grants us a lot of ability, but it also limits us. And so from there is, for what and how is data being used, right? So why are you collecting my data? How are you using that data? I should know about that. But that justice component, I should also be able to say no. And that's where the example like California Consumer Protection Act is a good place of like, I should have some choice and ability to comment it or be aware of what's happening. Then there's rights. Just in general, I don't think that needs much explaining. Consumer or participant rights, people have rights, and we should be thinking about the fact that we have implications as organizations. We're doing great things, but we can also do damage, right? And I think that's really important to just recognize and honor that individuals have rights, and we should always start from that space. Consent is a really important part of data justice, which is let me know every time my data is being used. Do I need to approve every time my data is being used? Are you just notifying me about the usage, or are you asking me, can it be used? That's where consent's really important because it also starts creating a sense of reliability and applicability. If you have individuals that are against what you're collecting or navigating, they might not really connect with you later on. So where is the purpose of trying to change a community or support a community rather, if you're almost like distancing them to your process? And then the last point I'll make is relatability and relevance of reporting. I often find that we collect data with really good intention, but because we didn't go through this process of participatory inclusiveness and making sure that what we're measuring and analyzing is important, we end up making inferences that just don't represent what people believe and see in their worlds. And so numbers can be great, but without context and judgment of that context, we land at a place of not applying what we intended to do. And so that's where we end up with multiple years of lag of we're trying to do this, but there's no impact. It's oftentimes because, well, you're not really like including people into this reporting, so they're not going to consume this information anyways. And so that's really the gamut here of data justice. And if there is any questions, I'm happy to take them a few times.
There is one in here that is, came early in, but just thinking about, you have somebody that's a data manager. Is that person also doing data governance, or should it be a different role? And I think the question came in when you were showing that data management does not equal data governance. How does that play out in the roles of organizations? And I think related to that, particularly for small organizations that may not be able to have so much separation between roles because they're volunteers or they're one or two staff.
That's a great question. And I appreciate that point. And I think that the important part here is that Yes, and some look, depending on your maturity as an organization, having a person that's like when you have a person dedicated to the implementation versus a person dedicated to the strategic vision and so forth. But for smaller organizations, I think where it ends up becoming important is for board members and other stakeholders that are part of that group to almost establish a working group, right? It doesn't have to be an individual. And in fact, there could be an ultimate decision maker for the governance practice. But what we are talking about here is how do we collectively define data governance? It's mostly about building those opportunities with those supports that you have, and also even including the members that you reach, right? If you're working directly in a community, they can be part of that data governance. We can call it a steering committee or some sort of data governance committee, but there's a place to start when we think about that. So I just say that yes, the challenges about who should be responsible is important, but I think also this shouldn't be a responsibility. Yes, there's ultimate decision makers, but this is a team effort. Data governance is a team effort, and it has multiple stakeholders from inside and out of the organization.
That's great, Heck. And I wonder if we can just touch on, because both you closed on this idea and also your answer to that question there is that overlap between the idea of stewardship and
Mm.
governance. Whereas an organization, we're holding and we're being entrusted with the data, but it belongs to the community of people that we serve. And how do we balance that? You were suggesting representation, certainly engaging participatory decision making in terms of seeing the inferences and the sense making activities. But for many of the communities we work with, that's very difficult to do. The communities may be hard for us to reach. They may be very fragmented. They may be individuals may be represented in there that don't wish to or are not safe to participate in those kind of activities. So how do you balance that responsible stewardship with the fragmented and hyper-local nature so often of the people that we're serving?
That's a really great question. And I think, a lot of considerations aside, I feel like the most important is to really think about, well, what's your mission at the end of the day? Because I think that importantly, coming back to like, if we need to figure out processes and create innovative approaches to actually engaging those communities. Do we need to use emerging technologies to try and start defining? Again, we came from a place of, oh, let's just throw a data governance framework or let's just develop one for there. But now we're almost working backwards and trying to tease it out. So I think the balance is around, yes, reach and capacity, but I think that most individuals just don't know. And that's why representation is important, because sometimes we trust the folks that go through the things we go through. And so
Right.
having that balance of internal support, but also almost like rigor to some degree that an outside participant can see, I think that's an important place for sure.
That's where some of the projects that we've worked on in TechSoup, we've had people that were previously a part of that community that may not be currently, particularly if we're dealing with individuals that may be experiencing trauma. We've done a lot of work in the domestic violence space, for example, where it's not always safe or appropriate, but you can still have representation by reaching out to others in that community and being, as you said, bringing a level of rigor, which we could always bring more. Heck, thank you so much. I have about 85 other questions that I jotted down, so expect to be invited back for a future talk, to dig into. And to everybody that's here, thank you for spending a half an hour with us. We very much appreciate it. As I said at the beginning, this TechSoup Talk series is going on all week. Tomorrow, we're going to be focused on miscommunication. The next day will be counter narratives. And we'll wrap it up on Friday with talk on collaboration. So I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much. Heck, thank you so much for the thoughtfulness.
Yeah, of course. That's be here. Thank you all. Take care. Bye.